Yeah, thank you, Eve. So my name's Matthew Pullen. I'm an Executive Vice President at CyrusOne, and I'm also the Managing Director of CyrusOne's European business.
CyrusOne.
Yeah.
And can you provide an overview of CyrusOne?
Yeah, absolutely. So, CyrusOne is commonly known as the third largest US headquartered provider of global colocation data centers. But to be fair, CyrusOne started in the US in 2001 and today operates approximately 65 data centers across the US, Europe, and we're in development in Japan. Really, CyrusOne's European operations didn't become present until 2018, following the acquisition of a business that I was involved in starting called Xenium Data Centers. And Xenium Data Centers was just operating in effectively Germany and the UK. And today CyrusOne operates across Europe with about 14 data centers, 5 in the UK, 5 in Germany, 1 in the Netherlands, 1 in Dublin, 1 in Paris, and 1 in Madrid. But we have land holdings that go beyond those countries, including Italy. Yeah, so it's a very interesting question, and I would say that life was somewhat more simple before 2023. And I say that because the market until 2023 was driven by enterprise cloud. And CyrusOne, like many of our competition, we develop and we operate data center capacity for hyperscale clients, for large, what we call at scale customers like software as a service companies, and also our enterprise customers. But since about 2014 in Europe, the market has been driven by the hyperscale customers, particularly the North American headquartered hyperscale customers. And their requirements were driven from the massive growth in the enterprise cloud market, where big enterprise companies across Europe were interested in putting their capacity effectively into the cloud. And I guess it's fair to say that our facilities and our competitors' facilities do represent the cloud. And the market was relatively straightforward in that data centers were required to be in urban and suburban locations close to the commercial centers that house the enterprise customers. But in 2023, we saw the impact of artificial intelligence, and something quite extraordinary happened in the United States, where we saw approximately 5 gigawatts of commitments made in one single year, which was driven by artificial intelligence requirements. And to put that into perspective, it had taken 10 years in Europe from 2014 to the beginning of 2023 for there to be roughly 3 gigawatts of capacity commitments. So we saw 1.5 times the level of commitment in 1 year in the US compared to 10 years of commitments in Europe. And it's interesting because the big question that everybody would like the answer for is how is AI going to impact the growth of the European data center market? Because in 2023 and 2024, the majority of the growth in the US was through the deployment of large language models. And what we haven't seen in Europe as yet is the deployment of large language models. What we've seen is small AI deployments, obviously some training and some inference, but those deployments have been made in the traditional data center locations in what we call availability zones. And so we just haven't seen the explosion of scale outside of those availability zones. And the question is, when will it happen? Not if, but which countries will be the main beneficiaries of the large language model deployments? And not because you're interviewing me, but because I truly believe it. France has got a very, very strong opportunity, because of the level of investment that France has been making really since 2018 in AI. And it's fair to say that France in many studies is viewed as probably the placed fifth in terms of global opportunity for AI, behind the US, China, Singapore, currently the UK, and then it's France. But France has been moving up the rankings very fast because of this incredible level of investment that's been made by the government and the support of Emmanuel Macron. Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I should start by saying, the reason why CyrusOne is a private company, because CyrusOne went from being a public company to a private company in 2022, and we have two of the world's biggest private equity investors as our sponsors, KKR and BlackRock. We did that because as a public company, we couldn't raise enough capital and maintain our investment grade status to meet demand, so we had to become private. And I don't think there's a shortage of capital to support the growth. I actually think the challenges in supporting growth are much more to do with headwinds caused by power infrastructure issues that we're seeing, potentially by regulation and legislation. So I think the market has challenges that aren't just to do with financing. So including just the simple availability of the mechanical and electrical equipment required to fuel the growth. So it goes back to what I was saying. The evolution of hyperscale is all about moving from just supporting enterprise cloud to supporting enterprise cloud and AI. I think importantly, enterprise cloud has still got an enormous amount of growth to come in Europe. If we think about last year, I would estimate that the adoption of enterprise cloud amongst companies in Europe was still close to 20%, and much less than half of the adoption of, say, companies in the United States. So there's huge growth in enterprise cloud, and then, as I said, we've just got to really see how AI impacts growth. Will we see large language model deployment as well as smaller training and inference? But I do firmly believe that when we start to see the AI deployments, we might see a shift in the distribution of data centers from a geographic perspective in Europe. A shift potentially away from or complementary to the two largest markets in Europe, which historically have been London and Frankfurt, to a more distributed model where the capacity really does follow the availability of cheaper power, and also moves towards the countries where there's more competitive tariffs as it relates to the hyperscale supply chain. And also I can't deny that legislation might also have quite an impact on the geographic distribution of data centers. Yeah, the biggest challenge is power, and network to some degree, but Europe, ever since deregulation in the late 1990s, has benefited from a lot of investment in network infrastructure. So I don't see that as a big problem. The biggest problem is power availability, and ensuring that availability is at reasonable cost. We've seen some countries really suffer by not anticipating data center demand early enough and investing in the upgrade of the national power infrastructure. So we've seen Ireland suffer very badly, and in fact, Ireland has had to seek power from France to be able to support ongoing growth. We've seen in West London real problems with the infrastructure capacity, and for the first time last year, we started to see issues in Frankfurt with infrastructure. So I do think power is the big issue, and it's not just a big issue within Europe. It's also a big issue as it relates to how we'll see the global distribution of data centers, because if we see the US relax its views on climate change, continue to support fossil fuels, continue to have a lot of power, cheap power capacity, that could influence just how AI is distributed globally, and could mean that Europe has some challenges.
Okay.
And I have to say, France has long been just one of the best countries in Europe in terms of deployment of infrastructure and anticipating infrastructure needs. And so when you think about France's position on power, you can quickly see why there's quite a lot of excitement about France from an AI deployment perspective. So I need to talk quickly about Europe's ambitions to be climate neutral as Europe by 2050. And the great desire is to see data centers climate neutral by 2030. And you might not know, but I'm currently the chair of the board of the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact, which represents about 85% of the industry, the colocation providers and also the hyperscalers. And the issue that we have is that in order for data centers to be climate neutral by 2030, that there needs to be a lot of support from Brussels, but also from the national governments towards providing more of a green grid. A transition, obviously, away from power that's driven by fossil fuels to power that's driven by renewables, ultimately a hydrogen grid. But the problem that everybody is facing is that there is just no way that we're going to see the development of hydrogen grids in the European countries within the timescale prior to 2030, maybe 2035 at best. And so we have a harsh reality to face, which is that if we want to enable data centers, but more broadly within the context of enabling the digital economy and be competitive on the world stage, we have to accept that there needs to be a transition from fossil fuel based power to greener power, and it might provide some really tough decisions for certain governments who are more environmentally leaning, to accept that there needs to be a transition, because getting to hydrogen quickly is going to be difficult, and even in countries that are supportive of nuclear with the SMR development, there's going to have to be a lot of environmental considerations that don't necessarily meet vision of being climate neutral for data centers by 2030 and the vision for being climate neutral for Europe by 2050. Totally. I think, Eve, one really important point to make is that data centers want to be efficient. And in fact, they have to be efficient, because unless our data centers are efficient, then we can't be competitive from a financial point of view for our customers. Because after all, we operate the data centers, but they pay us to operate the data centers. So they want us to do that in the most efficient way. And I think one of the challenges the industry has had is just explaining to Brussels and to governments and to people that the data centers are extremely efficient, the modern data centers, and are getting more and more efficient. For example, one of our data centers, our modern at-scale data centers, will probably be running with a PUE, power utilization efficiency, of say 1.2, which means that the 1 is the amount of power that's used by the servers, and the 0.2 is the rest of the power that is used to drive mainly the cooling infrastructure. And you might find smaller data centers, and often public sector data centers that have a PUE of say 5 are just really, really, really inefficient. And so what CyrusOne is doing, but the whole industry is doing, is trying to drive towards far greater efficiency. Interestingly, legislation in Europe is pushing the industry. We've seen regulation for the first time in the industry with the latest European Energy Efficiency Directive, which is currently about reporting the operating metrics of data centers. But individual countries in Europe are transposing the Energy Efficiency Directive into new energy efficiency laws. And as an example, for the first time, we've seen Germany dictate that all new data centers that become operational after July 2026 have to meet a PUE target of 1.2, which is quite aggressive legislation. Eve, you talked earlier about your involvement in heat reuse discussions. What we're, as an industry, trying to do is be as efficient with the waste products as we can, heat being one of those products. But we're finding more and more support in legislation and from communities where there's a desire to build municipal heating systems that the data centers can provide the heat to. And interestingly, that point is really important, because we're moving from a situation where data centers were largely based on air cooling to a situation with the much higher densities that are required because of the way in which the microprocessors are supporting AI workloads. We're moving towards what we call liquid to liquid cooling, where cooling is provided right to the proximity of the microprocessor through water loops. That gives us a great opportunity again to provide amenities to local communities, because the waste heat is effectively coming off at a much higher level, meaning that instead of having water that's the byproduct, the return at 25 degrees, we could see it as much as 65 degrees, which means that water can go directly into district heating systems without us needing to use heat pumps, which take energy to heat the water up, to push the water into municipal heating systems. I sort of more broadly, I'd say CyrusOne and the industry looks really at a number of things. It looks at particularly energy efficiency, and I've talked about that, reducing PUEs. Looking at clean energy, our customers, really do demand that we take the cleanest energy that we possibly can. Now, I know there's a lot of discussion about greenwashing because a lot of companies just take PPAs for renewable energy, but until countries can work out how that they efficiently provide renewable energy to data centers, which of course need a constant base load, so the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining. Some renewable energy sources can be difficult for data centers, but we try. CyrusOne, for example, through the use of offsets, albeit, does provide 100% green energy to its data center customers in Europe. We also look very hard at water conservation, and I think it's going to become more and more prevalent, because going back 10 years, it was quite common in the data center industry to use water to achieve very low PUEs, but that's not good for the environment. So people have moved towards closed loop chilled water, so not using any water in reality, but technologies are now such that those systems can deliver very low PUEs. And then really the last two areas, circular economy, I think is a real driver of the industry right through from development to operation. So, for example, in development, making sure that we have zero landfill when we're developing, making sure that we add biodiversity so that we net positive in terms of biodiversity contributions. And then finally, the circular energy systems, which we've talked about, so using the waste heat to drive municipal heating works, etc. But I think more and more communities are becoming interested in data centers, and I think we're moving past the point where communities were negative towards data centers because, to be honest, they didn't associate data centers with their day-to-day lives. They didn't truly understand that everything they do on a smartphone through the apps is actually supported by data centers. And so we did, CyrusOne just undertook a piece of research called Listening to Communities, where we survey through an independent company 30,000+ people across 7 countries in Europe. And it was very interesting to get the feedback as to what was important to them and how they perceive data centers. And I think the majority really saw data centers as a big opportunity to effectively add to the economic wealth of communities through the provision of jobs and skills, etc. So our focus is now moving well beyond making sure our data centers are efficient, are friendly to the planet, to now really focusing on communities and how we can benefit the communities more directly. Oh, yes, I totally agree. And it's interesting in terms of how I think about platforms. So geographically, we're very focused on rapid growth in the United States to support the large language model requirements. We're ready in Europe to adapt to the location strategy that our customers will pursue from an AI perspective once I think they've decided which will be the most favorable locations in Europe. And as I've said, I think France is undoubtedly going to be important, but also Southern Europe because of renewable energy and the lower cost of power. We need to be global because our customers really, because of their growth needs, they don't want to work with lots and lots and lots of companies like ours, because they just simply don't have the resources to deal with lots and lots of different companies. So we have to be global. We're now in Japan, but that's our only foothold in Asia. But Japan was an obvious market because of the scale of that market. So I think it's how we see the platform is basically continued globalization, really a very strong focus on rapid growth in the US, focus on Europe, but on the basis of needing to understand where the customer's requirements are going to settle, and then on expanding in Asia. So yeah, so I'll start with safety. You know, we're dealing with the world's largest companies, and they take safety extremely importantly. So our safety standards are second to none in development and in operations. And I think the point to make is that, you know, the data centers have extremely large infrastructure components, particularly as it relates to power. So the need to ensure very high safety standards is self-evident from what comprises a data center. From a security point of view, yeah, the environments that our customers have are critical environments. Physical security is extremely important. So, you know, that's one of the reasons why communities often have a perception of data centers as being, you know, big, dark, scary things. And you know, data centers generally have five layers of physical security, just because you know, what goes on in the data centers is often of critical national importance. So security is key. Interestingly, from a cyber security point of view, it's not perhaps as self-evident as I might describe, but our customers are responsible for their own network and for really the security of their own network, and insist always that there's no integration between our network and their network. So we have obviously networked to support the data centers, you know, to support the building management systems, energy management systems, but there is an absolute separation between our networks and the customers' networks, meaning that if we are subject to a cyber security attack, that there is no way in which that attack can find its way through to our customers. Interestingly, from a sovereignty point of view, and I'm very well aware of this because when CyrusOne bought Xenium in 2018, it was really after one of the first, and this was in Germany, one of the first countries to start looking at data centers as critical national infrastructure, and therefore having legislation to ensure that bad actors aren't involved in data centers, whether it be, you know, ownership or operations. And so that legislation is becoming more common. So the UK last year announced that data centers were considered to be critical national infrastructure, and we're seeing this more and more. Different countries take a different approach. In Germany, any data center over 5 megawatts is considered critical national infrastructure. In the UK, it's more to do with what's actually going on within the data center. But we obviously take these issues very seriously, and so you have critical national infrastructure legislation, but also you see more overarching legislation in the US and in Europe as it relates to things like the Cloud Act and other legislation that puts quite a heavy onus on really dictating how cloud services and ultimately AI services will be delivered and protected. So it's a great question, and sometimes I wonder, because developing and operating data centers, it isn't easy. It's tough. The capital investment required in building and operating data centers is significant, and there is a big shortage of talent in the industry, because the industry has grown so quickly. So trying to build, manage, and grow any business in the data center industry is difficult. But for me, when you look, for example, at what happened at the inauguration of Donald Trump, you see his family present, but you see the global community of technology leaders present at the inauguration. You appreciate just how amazing it is to be in the digital economy at this point in time. You know, the world is pivoting from old industry to the digital economy, and data centers are at the heart of that economic drive. And so it's an intoxicating place to be. And I think as long as we can be mindful that our growth has to benefit the planet and has to benefit communities, then it's going to be a great place to be for many years to come.